The air hung heavy and still over Mill Creek, Minnesota, a suffocating silence typical of the late summer of 1895. The heat was not merely a physical discomfort, it was a psychological pressure, pressing down on the small, isolated community. For 3 weeks, an oppressive drought had baked the dirt roads into cracked clay, and the normally lush fields of corn had withered into dry husks, rustling mournfully with every scarce breeze. The atmosphere, thick with the smell of dust and sun-baked timber, felt wrong, a prelude to something disastrous. Elias Thorne, a man in his late 20s with a prematurely weathered face and the intense, observant eyes of a dedicated journalist, stepped off the newly extended rail line at the rudimentary Mill Creek station. He carried a heavy satchel containing little more than a notepad, a few spare shirts, and a bulky, high-end photographic apparatus. A newfangled box camera capable of taking clearer, faster exposures than the old daguerreotype rigs. Elias wasn't there for the drought. He was there for the void left by a sudden, inexplicable catastrophe that had consumed the town's small world. Just 4 weeks ago, the entire student body and their solitary teacher, Ms. Clara Vance of the Mill Creek Rural School, had vanished. Not one child, not one adult remained. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, only the abandoned, pristine schoolhouse. Elias had followed the whisper of the story from the bustling, chaotic newsroom in St. Paul, sensing the unique and terrifying nature of the crime or event lurking beneath the local panic. He found lodgings in the only establishment offering a room, a faded boarding house run by Mrs. Elara Dunn, a woman whose eyes held the weary, guarded look of someone who had seen too much grief. "You're the city fellow," Mrs. Dunn stated, her voice dry as the cornfields. She didn't ask what he was doing. Everyone knew. The local sheriff, old Ben Cooper, he already packed up his chalk lines and went back to checking on stray livestock. Said there was nothing to see. Nothing to see but a dozen empty homes and a cold classroom, Mrs. Dunn. Elias countered gently, setting his bag down. "I came to find out why." She flinched at the mention of the classroom. "They were good children, quiet, no trouble. Ms. Vance, well, she was a strict but fair sort. Kept a clean slate." Elias spent the remainder of the day in the town, a collection of roughly 30 buildings clustered around a dried-up stretch of the creek. He spoke to farmers, the blacksmith, and the general store owner, all of whom gave him the same fragmented, anxious account. The children showed up Monday, learned their letters Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the school was empty. The local suspicion centered on the school itself. It was an old structure, built from local unseasoned pine, and stood about a half-mile outside the town center, isolated by a tangle of unkempt scrubland. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the dry landscape took on an unnerving gray hue, Elias walked to the schoolhouse. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if the last person had simply forgotten to push it shut. The silence inside was a physical weight. Dust motes danced in the last slanting beams of sunlight, illuminating the scene. Small wooden desks, each one bearing a name scratched into the varnish. A slate board with a perfectly written but unfinished arithmetic problem. A vase with a few dead field flowers on Ms. Vance's desk. It was an immediate, visceral punch of domesticity interrupted. His attention was drawn to a small dark object, tucked beneath a stack of graded papers on the teacher's desk. It was a tintype photograph, the popular form of the day, stiff and cold to the touch. The image was grainy but clear enough. Ms. Vance stood proudly in the center, a stiff, severe smile on her face, surrounded by her 12 students. They were all posed formally, as was custom, standing shoulder to shoulder in the late morning sun. Elias studied the image closely. The sun's angle suggested it was mid-morning. The children looked slightly fidgety, perhaps anxious to be done with the formality. The light caught the date scrawled faintly in ink on the reverse, August 15th, 1895. He compared the date to his notes. The children vanished on the morning of August 16th. This photograph was taken the day before. He flipped the image again, noting a tiny detail in the bottom corner of the photo. A barely visible, almost obscured figure standing far in the background, near the edge of the woods line. It was too distant and blurry to make out any features, but the shape was distinct. A tall, hunched silhouette that did not belong to the children or the teacher. A cold shiver, completely unrelated to the oppressive heat, traced its way up Elias's spine. He pulled out his own camera, setting it carefully on the desk. He took a photo of the classroom, then another, focusing on the empty chairs. The professional detachment he prided himself on was cracking. This wasn't a crime he was investigating. This was a rupture in reality, a cold spot in the logic of the world. Just as he was about to pack up, a floorboard directly beneath the teacher's desk creaked loudly, not under his weight, but on its own. A deep, unsettling groan. Elias froze, his hand hovering over his camera. The light was almost gone and the room was plunging into shadow. He told himself it was the house settling, the warping of old wood in the relentless heat. But the sudden, absolute silence that followed suggested otherwise. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the dirt and dust, and peered under the desk. Nothing but shadows and the rough underside of the desk surface. He tapped the floorboard that had groaned. It felt slightly loose, less secured than the others. With a quick, powerful shove, he wedged his pocket knife beneath the edge and pried it up. Beneath the floorboard, wrapped in a piece of faded gingham fabric, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. It was a terrifying amateur creation. Wide, staring eyes made of two small, mismatched buttons, and a perpetual, gaping wooden grin. It wasn't a child's toy. It was the kind of object an adult might carve in a moment of extreme focus, or perhaps extreme fear. Elias picked it up. It was light, almost weightless. As he turned it over, he saw a single, clear, engraved initial on its back. C. Was this a clue left by Clara Vance? If so, why hide it? And what did it mean? The mystery was beginning to deepen into something much more complex and chilling than a simple disappearance. The tintype photo and the hidden doll were his first solid pieces of evidence, but they only served to cloud the entire case in a new, heavy shroud of suspense. He stood up, the wooden doll clutched in his hand, feeling the weight of the empty schoolhouse pressing in on him. He had his story, but the true terror lay not in the missing people, but in the truth of how they vanished. Do you want to uncover the secrets of Mill Creek and find out what happened to Ms. Vance and her students? Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this chilling mystery. The doll felt cold and inert in Elias's palm, a crude piece of wood that shouldn't have held such immediate, profound significance. It was too ugly, too unsettling to be a simple toy. The heavy silence of the schoolhouse was broken only by the slight rustle of the dry cornfields outside, a sound that now seemed less like nature and more like a whispered warning. Elias replaced the loose floorboard, carefully concealing the doll and the tintype in his satchel. He needed to understand the C. He needed to know who else, besides Clara Vance, might have been connected to the school in such a personal, secretive way. He walked back to the boarding house under a sky thick with stars, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that seemed to cling to the ground. Mrs. Dunn was still awake, knitting by the dim light of an oil lamp. "You look like you've seen a ghost, city boy," she observed without looking up. "Worse than a ghost, Mrs. Dunn." "I saw an ending without a beginning," Elias said, his voice low. He didn't want to alarm her, but he needed a connection. "Do you know if Miss Vance had any close friends in town? Anyone she confided in?" Mrs. Dunn paused her needles. "Clara was a schoolteacher. She kept to herself. Came here 2 years ago from, I think, Iowa. But there was someone. Mrs. Ada Sterling. She's the closest thing Mill Creek has to a retired scholar. She tutored some of the older students privately, and her husband, before he passed, was the one who really pushed for the school to be built. Where can I find Mrs. Sterling? She lives out past the old mill, the one that's been standing idle for 20 years. A small cottage, secluded. She's a widow. Lost her only son to a fever 5 years back. A difficult woman, but honest. The next morning, The heat was already an exhausting presence by 7 o'clock. Elias rented a worn-out bicycle, the town's only concession to modern travel beyond the train, and cycled the dusty path toward the abandoned mill. The ride was torturous. The dry landscape offered no shade, and the monotony of the parched fields amplified his sense of isolation. Ada Sterling's cottage was small and meticulously kept, surrounded by a struggling garden. Ada herself was a woman of severe, unyielding posture, dressed in black, her face a map of old sorrow. She invited Elias into a parlor that smelled of dried lavender and old paper. "You're here about the children," Ada stated, her hands folded stiffly in her lap. It wasn't a question. Everyone in St. Paul thinks it was an accident. The sheriff thinks it was some kind of mass abduction by traveling vagrants. They are all wrong. "Mrs. Sterling, what do you think happened?" Elias pressed, leaning forward. "I think the schoolhouse swallowed them whole," she said, her eyes fixed on a spot past his shoulder. "But I have a better, more logical theory for a journalist like you." Ada explained that she was Ms. Vance's only true confidant. Clara, a deeply private woman, had been troubled in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Clara was hiding something from the town, Ada revealed. She had a small, iron-bound box. She kept it locked and always near her. She confided in me that it contained something that she was afraid would fall into the wrong hands. She never said what it was, only that it was evidence of something terrible that had happened years ago, connected to the school's founding. Evidence of what? She wouldn't say, but she was terrified someone would break in and take it. She told me she was going to write down a key piece of information, a name perhaps, and hide it somewhere safe outside the box, just in case. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. The carved doll, marked with C and hidden under the floorboards, suddenly made sense not as a mystical artifact, but as a marker, a signpost to a more critical clue. Did she ever mention the initial C or a specific hiding place? Ada frowned, concentrating. The C? No, but she was meticulous. She would only trust a place that was structurally sound, something built by a craftsman, not the rough floorboards. She had an appreciation for old work. "There's only one piece of furniture in that schoolhouse older than the building itself, the teacher's cabinet." The teacher's cabinet. A heavy oak chest used for storing textbooks and supplies, which Elias hadn't paid much attention to the night before. And the box itself? Was it found in the school? No, Ada said flatly. That's the point. When the sheriff investigated, he catalogued everything. The iron-bound box was the only item of personal property that belonged to Clara Vance that was missing from the school. This piece of information shifted the entire investigation. This was no mystical vanishing. This was a theft disguised as a mass disappearance. The children and Ms. Vance were not the victims of a ghostly phenomenon, but of someone who wanted the contents of that box badly enough to silence everyone who knew she possessed it. The C was a critical, deliberately hidden clue, likely pointing to the criminal. "Mrs. Sterling, thank you. You've given me something concrete. I need to get back to the schoolhouse," Elias said, rising quickly. "Be careful, young man," Ada warned, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Clara told me she had been watching a man, a shadow near the school in the evenings. She thought he was checking the lock. She described him as tall and slight, with a peculiar limp. And she said one more thing." "What was it?" "She said, 'He's been here all along, Ada. He's part of the foundations of this town.'" Elias left the cottage, the bicycle ride back feeling less like a chore and more like a desperate race against time. The photograph now served as a grim timeline. Hours after this picture was taken, Ms. Vance hid her clue, knowing she was being watched. The shadow with the limp, the missing box, the empty desks. He arrived back at the school, the sun now beating down fiercely. He went straight to the old oak cabinet. It was heavy, its doors bolted shut. He searched the exterior, running his fingers over the dark, aged wood. Nothing. He searched the interior, moving aside stacks of primers and slates. Still nothing. The clue had to be there. He noticed that the cabinet stood slightly off-center from a faint, dust-free rectangle on the floor. He tried to move it, but it was incredibly heavy. He finally braced his shoulder against it and shoved. The cabinet slid a few inches, scraping loudly on the wooden floor. Behind where the cabinet had stood, etched deeply into the wall's pine paneling, was a single word, crudely but firmly carved. Miller. Not a C at all, but a name. Miller. A key piece of information left by Clara, hidden precisely where the heavy cabinet would have protected it from discovery. But who was Miller? Was he the man with the limp, the figure in the background of the photograph? And what evidence had he or the box contained that was so critical to the school's founding that it was worth 13 lives? Elias quickly took a photograph of the carved name, his camera flash momentarily breaking the oppressive gloom. He had moved past the disappearance and was now staring directly into the heart of a calculated, terrifying crime that had been hidden under the guise of an unsolved mystery. He realized that the clock had not stopped 4 weeks ago. It was still ticking. The person who took the box, the person who killed the students and the teacher, was still here, walking the dusty streets of Mill Creek. The investigation was now an immediate threat to his own life. Elias Thorne spent the evening poring over his notes, the heat making concentration a struggle. The name Miller was the solid lead he craved, a human, non-supernatural element that anchored the terrifying events to reality. He had 3 key pieces of evidence: the tintype photo showing the mysterious silhouette near the woods, the hidden doll, which acted as a marker, and the name Miller carved into the schoolhouse wall. The core mystery was now, who is Miller and what was in the iron-bound box? He returned to the general store, the unofficial information hub of Mill Creek. He needed a casual yet probing question. "I'm trying to trace some of the families that founded the school," Elias said to the storekeeper, a man named Mr. Hemlock, who was polishing a kerosene lamp. "I notice the school seems to be built on an old plot. Were there any founding families named Miller?" Mr. Hemlock paused, his rag hovering over the glass. "Miller? Sure, there was a Miller, Silas Miller, a good 10-15 years back. He was one of the early settlers, a carpenter. He worked on a lot of the structures around here, including the school itself. But he's long gone, up and left with his wife and 2 young boys shortly after the schoolhouse was finished. Didn't even sell his land, just abandoned it. Nobody's heard from him since. Bad luck, that family. Did he have a particular connection to the school's founding, perhaps a disagreement? Not that I recall. He built it, took his pay, and disappeared. Folks figured he'd found better work out west." Elias realized that the name Miller might not be the culprit, but the victim, or the key to understanding the evidence in the box. If Silas Miller was the carpenter, he would have known the building's secrets and perhaps been privy to the land deals. The trail had gone cold back to 1895. Elias needed history. He recalled Ada Sterling's description of the missing box's contents. Evidence of something terrible that had happened years ago connected to the school's founding. This pushed the timeline back to the early 1880s. The nearest decent library was in the county seat, 20 miles away. Elias spent an exhausting, dusty morning riding his bicycle there. The library was a small but dedicated room of records. He focused his search on 2 things: local newspapers from the 1880s and the official county records concerning the land grant for the Mill Creek schoolhouse. The old newspapers yielded nothing about a local scandal, only the usual items of crop yields and Sunday sermons. However, the county property records were more enlightening. The land for the Mill Creek schoolhouse, parcel 47, was originally part of a much larger plot owned by the Mill Creek Land Development Company, an investment group based in St. Paul. The key transaction was dated October 1884. The records showed that the company sold the parcel for a nominal fee to a newly formed local trust called the Mill Creek Community Education Board. The signatories on the deed were 3 prominent citizens of the time: Thomas Vance, Miss Clara Vance's uncle, Elias Sterling, Ada Sterling's late husband, and a man named Jeremiah Cooper, the father of the current sheriff, Ben Cooper. The land transfer itself was unremarkable, but Elias noticed a significant irregularity in the legal description addendum. The coordinates in the addendum, which defined the plot boundaries, were changed by hand in a thin, shaky ink, not the firm hand of the county clerk who had signed the rest of the document. This change subtly shifted the boundary line by about 20 feet, encompassing a small, unremarkable patch of marshy land that was adjacent to the original plot. Why make such a precise, handwritten alteration to include a piece of unusable marsh? Elias remembered Mrs. Sterling mentioning the school's foundation. He looked back at the general information on the property. Original owner of parcel 47, the Mill Creek Land Development Company. Carpenter who built the school, Silas Miller. Signatories on the deed, Vance, Sterling, Cooper. Elias had a terrifying flash of understanding. The missing box contained the original unaltered land deed. Ms. Vance, perhaps finding the deed among her late uncle's papers, realized the truth. The handwritten alteration was a forgery, and the original owner of that small, marshy 20-foot strip was the key. He returned to the old newspaper archive, looking for any mention of land disputes, especially those involving the Land Development Company, or anyone who might have protested the acquisition of the land in 1884. After hours of painstaking work, he found it. A small, almost buried legal notice from September 1884, just weeks before the forged deed was signed. It was a formal protest filed against the Mill Creek Land Development Company for the illegal seizure of a small family-owned parcel of land. The name of the plaintiff who had lost the land, Silas Miller. Silas Miller hadn't simply left. He had been cheated out of his property, the same land that the schoolhouse now stood on. The handwritten alteration on the final deed was the subtle shift made to incorporate Miller's seized parcel, which included his original homestead boundary. The evidence in the box was the original true deed that would prove the school was built on stolen land, a scandal that would ruin the families of Vance, Sterling, and Cooper. Elias felt a cold certainty settle over him. Clara Vance discovered the truth of her own family's corruption, and she was killed to protect it. But who was the killer? Silas Miller had disappeared over a decade ago. It had to be a descendant or an accomplice. The figure in the background of the tintype, the tall and slight man with a limp. He focused on the remaining signatory, Jeremiah Cooper, and Jeremiah's son, the current Sheriff Ben Cooper. Elias packed his notes, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The official story of the vanishing was a cover-up for a conspiracy that went back 12 years, and the person who stole the box was the only one who could have committed the massacre. He had to get back to Mill Creek and confront Sheriff Cooper. But he knew with chilling certainty that the man who had buried the truth for 12 years would not hesitate to bury the only man who had found it. The danger was no longer abstract. It was wearing a badge. Elias returned to Mill Creek, the sun setting in a blaze of ominous red and orange. The atmosphere was charged with an almost visible tension, a mixture of the intense ongoing drought and the terrifying implication of his discovery. He went directly to the sheriff's office, a cramped, dusty room connected to the town jail. Sheriff Ben Cooper was a large, heavy-set man in his late 40s, his uniform perpetually wrinkled. He was cleaning his shotgun, a casual, almost bored demeanor masking something Elias couldn't quite read. "Back again, Thorne?" Cooper asked, not looking up. "Told you, case is closed, mass disappearance, nothing to do here." "I found something, Sheriff," Elias said, placing the 2 photographs he had taken, the carved name and the tintype, on the desk. The school was built on stolen land. The evidence was in a box owned by Ms. Vance. The names involved were your father, Thomas Vance, and Elias Sterling. Cooper finally looked up, his eyes hard and cold without a hint of surprise. "You're peddling gossip and old news, Thorne. Land disputes happen. That was settled decades ago. And my father is dead. Leave the dead alone." "It wasn't settled, Sheriff. Your father, Vance, and Sterling forged a deed to steal property from Silas Miller. Ms. Vance found the original deed, and she was silenced to keep it quiet. The original deed, the evidence, was the only thing missing from that schoolhouse. Elias pushed the tintype forward. This photo was taken the day before the vanishing. Look closely, Sheriff. In the background, a figure, tall, slight, hunched. Cooper picked up the tintype, holding it close to the lamp. He stared at the blurry figure for a long moment. Elias watched his face for any flicker of recognition, any sign of guilt or fear. There was none. Only a calm, resolute denial. It's a shadow, a tree branch, or maybe just the lens playing tricks. You're weaving a tapestry of fiction from dust, Thorne. People vanish. It happens. You should take your city theories back to St. Paul before you stir up real trouble in my town. Elias realized he was making a critical mistake. If Cooper was involved, a direct confrontation would only endanger him further. He needed proof that connected Cooper personally to the crime, not just his father. He took a calculated risk. I have the doll she left, Sheriff. The one with the C. It was a marker leading to the name Miller. Elias lied, omitting the part that he'd hidden the doll. He wanted to see if Cooper knew the doll existed. Cooper's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a tremor of genuine unease passed through his frame. Doll? There was no doll. We searched that schoolhouse top to bottom. You're lying. You're trying to create a theatrical ending for your trashy paper. The absence of surprise when Elias mentioned the forgery and the missing box was chilling. Cooper knew the scandal, but the mention of the doll, the final personal clue, got a reaction. He wasn't involved in the initial cover-up, but he was involved in the final search and cleanup. He knew what was supposed to have been found and what was not. Elias had hit a wall. Cooper would never admit to anything, and he would certainly not cooperate. As Elias left the office, the sheriff's words echoed in his ears. Take your city theories back, before you stir up real trouble. It was a clear, unambiguous threat. Back at the boarding house, Elias felt the strain of the investigation. He was alone, 20 miles from help, and the local authority was either the killer or covering for the killer. He looked out the window. The streets were deserted. The silence of Mill Creek, once comforting, was now suffocating. He noticed something on the dusty road below his window. A faint trail of deeper impressions in the dirt, a slight dragging or scuffing pattern that led from the corner of the block to the front of the boarding house, then back. It was a faint yet distinct track, consistent with someone having a limp. He immediately grabbed his camera and headed downstairs. Mrs. Dunn was in the kitchen. Mrs. Dunn, I need to know something. Did the sheriff, Ben Cooper, ever have a limp or an injury that caused him to drag his foot? Mrs. Dunn stopped cutting vegetables, her face pale. Ben Cooper? No. Ben's always been strong as an ox. Never a scratch that stuck. Thank you. Elias knew the answer. It wasn't the sheriff. It was someone else. Someone watching him. Someone who had been watching Miss Vance. The tall, slight man with a limp from Ada Sterling's description and the silhouette in the photograph was the one who took the box and executed the atrocity. Elias walked out to the road. The tracks were clearer now that the sun had completely set. They were definitely a shuffle, a drag. Someone had been standing directly in front of the house, watching his window. He turned to look up the street, a sense of immediate, visceral panic flooding his system. He saw a shape move rapidly into the shadow of the old general store, tall, slight. The movement was a hurried, uneven gait, the limp. Elias fumbled with his camera, trying to focus in the near darkness, but the figure was gone. He raced back into the boarding house, locking the door behind him. He looked at the tintype again. The figure in the background was standing right near the edge of the woods, the same scrubland surrounding the school. This man had been watching the school for days. He was a local, close enough to track, but removed enough to be unseen. Elias thought back to the name on the land deed. Silas Miller's stolen property. The storekeeper had mentioned that Miller had left with his wife and 2 young boys. He went back to the old land grant records he had photographed in the library. The original survey documents often included the ages of the property owner's family members at the time of the land dispute. Elias found the relevant page and read the small, faded handwriting in the margin. Silas Miller, wife Mary, son Thomas, age 10, son Samuel, age 8. The two young boys were now men in their 20s or early 30s, the right age for a tall, slight figure. One of them perhaps returned for revenge. He remembered Mrs. Sterling's words. He's been here all along. He's part of the foundations of this town. The killer had to be one of the Miller boys, living under a new identity, or one that was so unremarkable no one ever noticed him. Elias pulled out the single piece of evidence that could truly connect the killer to the crime: the carved doll with the C. It was a clue left by Clara Vance for someone, Ada Sterling perhaps, but what if the C was a trap? What if the killer knew she would leave a clue and deliberately left the doll as a misdirection, hiding the real clue, the name Miller, in the wall? No. The doll was under the floorboard where Clara worked. The name Miller was hidden behind the cabinet. Clara was a careful, meticulous woman. She used the doll to mark the exact location to start searching for the real clue behind the heavy cabinet. The doll was real. The knowledge was electrifying, but the danger was immediate. He was not just tracking a criminal anymore, the criminal was tracking him. He had to find out the identity of the Miller son before he became another casualty of Mill Creek's terrible secret. Elias knew he had to act fast. His life was on the line, and the killer with the limp was watching his every move. He needed to find out which of Silas Miller's two sons, Thomas or Samuel, had stayed or returned to Mill Creek. He couldn't trust the sheriff, and the general storekeeper was uninformed. Only Ada Sterling, the quiet, observant widow, remained as a possible source of historical insight. He cycled back to Ada Sterling's cottage early the next morning, the heat already promising to be unbearable. Ada was tending her wilted garden when he arrived. She saw the desperation in his face. "You found something," she stated, leaning on her hoe. "The Mill Creek schoolhouse was built on stolen land, Mrs. Sterling," Elias said, omitting the details about Cooper. "Your husband, my family's uncle and the sheriff's father, forged a deed to take the property from the original owner, Silas Miller. Miss Vance found the original deed, the evidence, and she was killed for it." Ada dropped the hoe. It clattered against the dry earth. Her face, usually so composed, crumbled into an expression of intense, long-held pain. "I knew it," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "I knew Elias was hiding something. He grew distant, closed off after the school opened. He would wake up screaming about the marshland and the hollow space. I tried to ask him, but he told me he swore an oath to the others, a sacred trust, and I was not to interfere." "Did your husband ever mention Silas Miller's family? His sons, Thomas and Samuel?" "Yes." "Oh God, yes." Ada breathed, tears finally welling in her eyes. "Silas Miller. He wasn't just wronged by the forgery. Elias told me that Silas came back years after the theft. He was a poor, broken man. He tried to confront the board, my husband, Vance, and Cooper. They turned him away, told him to leave, or they'd have him arrested for vagrancy." Ada paused, gathering her composure. "Silas didn't leave that day. He took his youngest son Samuel to the site and showed him the land. He told Samuel that the schoolhouse was a monument to their family's betrayal. Silas was obsessed. He grew ill shortly after and died penniless." "And the son Samuel, did he leave with his older brother Thomas?" "No," Ada said, her voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Samuel stayed. He was just a boy then, maybe 12 or 13. Elias felt terrible, a crushing guilt. He tried to help the boy discreetly. He got Samuel a job, a quiet manual labor job that kept him out of sight and out of mind, but kept him in Mill Creek." "What was the job, Mrs. Sterling?" Elias demanded, leaning closer. "Samuel became the grounds and maintenance man for the entire rail line that runs near the schoolhouse. He was responsible for checking the tracks, clearing the brush, and replacing the old cross ties. It's a job that requires him to be tall and slight to fit into the cramped spaces beneath the ties, and the constant heavy labor gave him a terrible limp when he walked." Elias felt a terrifying certainty. Samuel Miller. The shadow in the tintype, the watcher with the limp, the quiet man with a 12-year grudge, the one who saw his father ruined by the families of Vance, Sterling, and Cooper. He had been there all along, unnoticed, waiting. The foundations of the town that Ada had mentioned. Where does Samuel live now, Mrs. Sterling? He lives in an old abandoned watchman's shack, right by the place where the rail line crosses the old Mill Creek tributary, she said, pointing vaguely toward the northern scrubland. He only comes into town for supplies. He's a ghost to most people, never married, never made friends. Elias realized that Samuel Miller didn't simply kill Clara Vance to protect the current power structure. He killed her for a deeper, more personal reason. She was a Vance, one of the 3 families who betrayed his father. The children were collateral damage, silenced because they were students in the school of betrayal, or worse, because they knew Samuel Miller as the quiet man who maintained the grounds. Mrs. Sterling, I have to go to him. He has the box, the deed, the proof. No, Mr. Thorne, you can't, Ada pleaded, grabbing his arm. If he killed all those people for a piece of paper, what will he do to you? You are a public person. Go to the sheriff. He's the law. The sheriff knows about the forgery, Mrs. Sterling, and he's protecting his father's memory, Elias explained grimly. I'm on my own, but I have one more thing to show you. The doll. Elias pulled the crude, button-eyed doll from his satchel. Ms. Vance left this under her desk, marking the clue. The C on the back, I thought it was for Clara. Ada took the doll, her hand trembling. She turned it over, staring at the faint, single initial carved into the back. A look of profound, cold horror washed over her features. It's not Clara, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not C for Clara Vance. Then what is it? My son. My only son. The one who died of the fever 5 years ago. He was a peculiar boy. He loved to carve things. He was a close student of Ms. Vance's predecessor, but he also visited the new school after Clara took over. He was the only child who ever called me his guardian of the creek because of this cottage. She ran her thumb over the doll's back. That is the initial he was known by to his closest friends, the one he signed his work with. He was an incredibly bright, observant boy, and he was the one who helped his father Elias with the paperwork. He was meticulous with detail. So what is the initial, Mrs. Sterling? Ada took a shaky breath. It's the initial for his formal name, the one he insisted on using when he did any kind of work. The C is a stylized, old-fashioned G. G for guardian. Elias stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The doll wasn't from Clara Vance. It was the artifact of a long-dead boy. My son's full name, Ada stated, her voice heavy with the crushing weight of this final, horrifying revelation, was George Sterling, and he died of a fever after spending weeks in the schoolhouse, weeks after the forgery was committed and covered up. Ms. Vance found this doll, and she knew. She didn't leave the doll as a clue. She found it, and it told her that the evidence she found was connected to a child's death. The original deed was not just proof of land theft. It was proof that the theft, the cover-up, and the moral rot of the town had directly caused the death of a child. The Miller family was wronged, but the Vance, Sterling, and Cooper families had blood on their hands. The killer, Samuel Miller, didn't just want revenge for his father. He wanted justice for the death of George Sterling, the child whose illness was likely related to the poor construction and the marshy, unhygienic conditions of the stolen land on which the school was built. Elias had one final, terrifying destination: the rail watchman's shack. He was no longer just searching for a killer and a deed. He was searching for the final, gruesome connection that tied together all the years of silence and all the deaths in Mill Creek. The watchman's shack was a desolate, isolated structure, little more than a corrugated iron hut nestled alongside the twisting, dry creek bed about a mile from the nearest road. The rails, warped by the heat, shimmered under the intense midday sun. Elias approached cautiously, leaving his bicycle hidden in a thicket of dry brush. The shack smelled of old grease, stale tobacco, and an undercurrent of something metallic and faintly sweet, the smell of old blood, Elias recognized with a sickening lurch. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the faint breeze. Elias drew the only protection he had, a small, sturdy bladed pocket knife. He pushed the door open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence. Inside, the shack was sparse. A cot, a small stove, a few tools for maintaining the track, a heavy maul, spikes, a wrench. There were crude drawings taped to the wall, detailed, almost obsessive sketches of the Mill Creek schoolhouse, floor plans, elevations, and one diagram showing the precise coordinates of the land boundary. Samuel Miller had been watching and waiting for years. Then Elias saw it. On a small, rickety wooden table, illuminated by a single, dusty window pane, sat the iron-bound box. It was unlocked. Elias rushed forward, his heart hammering in his chest, and flipped the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of old, faded velvet, was the original, unaltered deed. The document was old, brittle and stained, but the text was clear, proving that the schoolhouse sat on land illegally stolen from Silas Miller. But that wasn't the only thing. Folded neatly beneath the deed was a handwritten letter, penned in a clear, forceful hand, the writing of Ms. Clara Vance. Elias unfolded the letter and began to read. "To whomever finds this, know that the sin of the fathers is a living wound. I found this deed among my Uncle Thomas's papers. He was not a good man. He and his associates, Elias Sterling and Jeremiah Cooper, conspired to take the Miller land. It was not just a property crime. The low-lying marsh they incorporated into the new boundary, Silas Miller's original homestead, is toxic. When the school was built, the foundations were laid directly into the stagnant, insect-ridden marsh. The children got sick. George Sterling died because of the conditions caused by the forgery, conditions that could have been avoided had the proper dry land been purchased. The letter confirmed Ada Sterling's final, devastating revelation. The forgery was a crime of greed, and the ensuing conditions led to a child's death. Samuel Miller knows this. I found him watching the school. He did not tell me his name, but I saw the fire in his eyes. He has an acute, twisted sense of justice. He believes the only way to redeem his father's honor and atone for George Sterling's death is to remove the proof of the crime and erase the consequences of the crime. The evidence of the forgery is this deed. The consequence is the schoolhouse itself and everyone connected to it. I fear he sees the children and myself not as innocent, but as extensions of the corrupt foundation. They are the fruit of the poisonous tree. He believes that by making the school disappear, he is wiping the slate clean for his father and for George. He is not a vagrant or a fiend. He is a madman obsessed with righteous eradication. Elias finished reading, the paper shaking in his hand. Samuel Miller was not a random killer. He was a meticulous executioner with a frightening, inverted sense of morality. He hadn't wanted the box for the evidence. He had wanted it to destroy it, to eliminate the last piece of proof of the town's original sin, and then to destroy the living symbol of that sin, the school and its occupants. He looked around the shack for any sign of Samuel. He was gone. But then Elias saw something chilling. Behind the cot, a set of clothes, Samuel's uniform, was crumpled on the floor, and lying next to it, partially obscured, was a leather satchel identical to his own, but well-worn and dusty. He approached it, his stomach turning. He opened the leather flap. Inside, wrapped in a linen cloth, were 12 sets of children's clothing and one small woman's dress, neatly folded but stained with dry earth. Elias recoiled. Samuel hadn't just murdered them. He had stripped them of their identities and disposed of them in a way that left no trace, making them impossible to identify, forcing the town to label the event a mass disappearance. The body disposal was part of the plan to erase the consequences. The realization struck Elias like a physical blow. Samuel Miller was coming back. This was his sanctuary. He had left the box as a trap to lure Elias in and force a confrontation. He didn't just want the school to disappear, he wanted the story to disappear. Elias Thorne, the man who knew the truth, was the final piece of evidence to be eradicated. A distant but distinct sound cut through the silence. The rhythmic, uneven thud-shuffle-thud of the killer's heavy, limping gait approaching the shack from the direction of the rail line. Samuel Miller was close. Elias had the deed, the letter, and the gruesome proof of the children's fate. He couldn't fight Samuel, a man hardened by years of manual labor and consumed by psychotic rage. He had to run. He grabbed the box, the deed, and the letter. He paused only for a second, then quickly took a photo of the neatly folded clothes in the satchel, the final, undeniable proof of the murders. He threw the door open and bolted toward the thicket where his bike was hidden. He heard Samuel Miller's voice, rough and low, cutting through the heat haze. "You shouldn't have dug, mister. You were supposed to let it die." Elias threw his leg over the bicycle, shoving off into the dry, dusty road, the wheels skidding wildly. Behind him, Samuel Miller emerged from the scrub, a heavy, spiked tool, the rail maul lifted over his shoulder, his face a mask of cold, unblinking fury. The chase was on. The rickety bicycle offered little defense against the relentless pursuit of Samuel Miller. The killer, despite his limp, was fueled by 12 years of bottled-up rage and the desperate need to protect his final act of vengeance. Elias pedaled furiously along the dirt path that paralleled the train tracks, the sun beating down mercilessly. He glanced over his shoulder. Samuel was not sprinting, but his thud-shuffle-thud gait was terrifyingly efficient, covering ground with an unnerving machine-like rhythm. He held the heavy maul like an extension of his own arm. Elias knew the sheriff was no help, and he couldn't outrun a man determined to kill him in this heat. He needed to get the evidence, the deed and Ms. Vance's letter, to the one person in Mill Creek who was both trustworthy and capable of understanding the magnitude of the truth. Ada Sterling. He veered off the main path, cutting across a barren, rocky field toward the direction of Ada's cottage. The terrain was treacherous, and the bicycle skidded, throwing Elias into a patch of dried thistles. He scrambled back up, tasting dust and blood, but the deed was still clutched in his hand. He looked back. Samuel had stopped at the edge of the field, not wanting to risk the uneven ground that might further strain his limp. He simply stood there, a dark, imposing silhouette against the pale sky, watching. Elias had bought himself a few crucial minutes. He got back on the bike, his legs burning with exertion, and finally reached the relative safety of the road near the old mill. He pushed himself to Ada's cottage, collapsing against her fence, gasping for air. Ada rushed out, alarmed. "Mr. Thorne, what happened?" "Samuel Miller," Elias managed, handing her the iron-bound box which contained the original deed and Clara Vance's letter. "He took them. He killed them all. It was the land, the forgery, and George's death. It's all here. Read the letter, Mrs. Sterling. You need to know the truth about your husband." Ada's hands trembled as she took the box. She looked at the blood on Elias's face, then back down the road. "He's coming, isn't he?" "Yes. He sees me as the last piece of evidence. He will come here to finish it." Elias knew the isolated cottage was a death trap. "We have to leave now, get to town. Get to the sheriff. No, not the sheriff, the town itself. Get people to see this." Ada, surprisingly, found a sudden, steely resolve. The truth about her husband's crime and her son's death had shocked her into clarity. "I won't run, Mr. Thorne. I am the only one who can identify the original deed. And I have something he wants too. He's not just after the paper." She went back inside and quickly returned, holding the wooden doll with the G inscription. "He knows I have this. It was his father, Silas, who carved the original. A decoy, an offering to George after the land was stolen. Samuel found it. He knew I had the last true connection to both the victims of the forgery and the initial child victim. Then we use it," Elias said, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "We use it to expose him. We don't run. We make him come to the center of town." Elias thought desperately about the best way to get to the center of Mill Creek without being intercepted. The main road was long and exposed. "The rail line," he said, pointing. "It runs straight into the back of the train depot. If we move fast, we can use the rails to get there. It's hidden by the tall corn stalks most of the way." They moved immediately, slipping into the shadow of the tall, dried cornfield that bordered the rail tracks. The stalks were brittle and sharp, scratching at their clothes, but they provided crucial cover. They hadn't gone 20 yards when they heard the distinctive thud, shuffle, thud on the rail ties behind them. Samuel Miller had anticipated their move. Elias and Ada were forced to walk directly on the raised rail lines, which was difficult and slow. Ada, though older, was driven by a terrible new purpose. Elias kept the box visible, hoping to lure Samuel close enough for a confrontation in a more public space. Suddenly, Ada gasped and pointed. Down the line, coming from the direction of the Mill Creek train depot, was an approaching shadow. Not a man. The daily freight train. "The train! We have to get off the tracks!" Ada yelled. But Samuel Miller, spotting the train, changed his tactics. He emerged from the cornfield, and with a terrifying burst of speed that belied his limp, lunged forward. He wasn't trying to intercept them, he was trying to cut them off. He placed the heavy maul across the rail line, creating an intentional, dangerous obstruction. He then turned to Elias and Ada, a terrifying, triumphant smile on his face. "You can't get away," Samuel called out, his voice hoarse with exertion. "It all ends here. The final erasure." Elias realized the immediate danger. If the freight train hit the mall, it would derail, causing an enormous catastrophic accident, furthering Samuel's goal of complete eradication of the evidence and the witnesses. Elias and Ada were trapped between the oncoming train, the mall, and the killer. Elias, the journalist. Elias quickly pulled his camera from the satchel. He didn't have time to set up a tripod or even focus properly. As the train's horn blared, a desperate final warning, Elias raised the heavy box camera, aimed it at the killer, who was standing defiantly over his obstruction, and fired the shutter. The flash of the camera, a white, incandescent burst of light, was the only thing that pierced the gathering gloom of the evening. In that single blinding flash, Elias had done the only thing he could. He had captured the killer in the act, preserving the final damning piece of evidence that tied the 12-year-old crime to the recent massacre. The flash of Elias's camera was a momentary act of defiance, a desperate attempt to weaponize the truth against the physical force of Samuel Miller. The killer, momentarily blinded by the magnesium flash, shielded his eyes, pausing his advance. This single moment of distraction was all the chance Elias and Ada needed. "Run! Now!" Elias yelled, grabbing Ada's arm and pulling her off the rail line and into the thick, dry cornfield just as the heavy locomotive rounded the final bend. The train hit the heavy maul that Samuel had placed on the tracks with a sickening, violent crunch. The maul, a solid iron tool, was instantly shattered, and the resulting debris caused the lead wheels of the locomotive to jump the track. The engine let out a tortured shriek of scraping metal, steam, and compressed air, followed by the terrifying, prolonged groan of the freight cars buckling behind it. Elias and Ada were thrown to the ground as the earth beneath them vibrated violently. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the sound of tearing metal. The train had derailed, coming to rest with the engine listing dangerously, several freight cars twisted and piled like children's toys. The dust and steam provided a momentary, welcome cover. Elias pulled Ada deeper into the cornfield, moving in a crouch. "We need to get to the town," he rasped, his lungs burning from the dust and the heat. They reached the edge of the field, near the back fence of the Mill Creek train depot, and collapsed. The accident had done what Elias's investigation could not. It had brought the town to them. Alarms were ringing, lights were coming on, figures were running toward the crash site. Elias knew this was his only window. He looked for Samuel Miller. The killer, realizing his final act of eradication had failed, was scrambling away from the wreck, retreating back into the scrubland, his limp more pronounced than ever. He was defeated, but not caught. "The sheriff," Ada gasped, pointing. Sheriff Ben Cooper was running toward the scene, his face a mixture of panic and confusion. Elias, still holding the box, stumbled toward Cooper. "Sheriff, it was Samuel Miller. He derailed the train. He killed the students and Ms. Vance." Cooper was focused on the wreck. "What? Miller? Impossible. Get out of the way, Thorne. This is a disaster zone." "No, this is the disaster. Your father's crime. Read this." Elias shoved the iron box and the deed into Cooper's hands. "The original deed. The one that proves your father, Vance, and Sterling stole the land. Ms. Vance found it and was killed. Samuel Miller is the killer, seeking justice for his father and George Sterling." Cooper looked down at the box, then back at Elias, his eyes wide and vacant. The weight of his father's 12-year-old sin was suddenly a physical burden. He knew instinctively that Elias was telling the truth. The piece of paper felt like a lead weight. "It's a lie," Cooper whispered, but the conviction was gone. He looked at Ada, who stood beside Elias, her face streaked with tears and dirt, holding the crude wooden doll. "Ben," Ada said, her voice shaking but steady, "I have the doll. George's doll. He died because of the marsh. Your father, my husband, and Thomas Vance killed my boy. The children were collateral. Samuel Miller is mad, but he is a symptom of your town's secret. You need to read that deed and face the truth." Just then, a figure stumbled out of the wreckage. It was the train conductor, bruised and shaking but alive. He pointed a trembling finger. "There, that man, the one with the limp. He was standing on the tracks. He did this. He was carrying a maul." The conductor's testimony, combined with the evidence and the witnesses, broke Sheriff Cooper. He looked at the deed, then at Ada, then at the smoking wreckage of the train. A catastrophe directly caused by the man Elias had accused. "Dear God," Cooper murmured, finally accepting the horrifying reality. He grabbed his pistol, his face etched with a mix of shame and renewed purpose. Which way did he go? "Into the scrubland, toward the creek," Elias said. "He won't stop, Sheriff. He wants to erase everything. The truth, the witnesses, the town." Cooper looked at Elias, his eyes full of cold, sober respect. "You were right, Thorne. I'm going after him. But you get this deed, this letter, and this witness to the telegraph office. Send the full story to St. Paul. You expose us. You expose the truth. Don't let me stop you, no matter what happens next." The sheriff, a flawed man finally facing his duty, ran toward the dark, desolate creek. Elias and Ada did not follow. They went straight to the telegraph office at the depot, which was miraculously still operational, its line to St. Paul intact. While Ada stood guard, the iron box clutched to her chest, Elias began to frantically write the telegram. He compressed the entire horrifying saga. The forgery, the death of George Sterling, Clara Vance's discovery, the missing deed, Samuel Miller's motive, the 12-year grudge, the children's folded clothing, and the deliberate derailment. He concluded by naming the man currently pursuing the killer, Sheriff Ben Cooper. Elias finished the telegram, handed the pages to the stunned operator, and paid the fee. The truth, raw and undeniable, was now racing along the wire to St. Paul. As the operator began tapping out the message, Elias finally allowed himself to breathe. The story was out. The cover-up was over. He looked at Ada. "We need to go back to the schoolhouse," he said. Samuel's final act wasn't the derailment, it was the vanishing. He took the bodies somewhere. If he was focused on erasing all trace, he must have buried them on the stolen marshland itself, the toxic place that started it all. Elias realized that the most terrifying part of the mystery, the location of the bodies, was the final key to Samuel's twisted, righteous logic. The journey back to the schoolhouse felt different this time. The moon, now high, cast long, deep shadows, but the air no longer felt oppressive. The immediate danger had passed, replaced by a cold, resolute sense of purpose. The truth was out, and now the search for justice began. Elias and Ada walked past the silent, deserted Mill Creek train depot, the distant shouts of the wreck crew fading behind them. They reached the edge of the scrubland where the school stood, a solitary dark shape against the prairie sky. "The marshland," Ada whispered, pointing to the small, overgrown patch of ground immediately adjacent to the schoolhouse's rear wall. "This is it. This is the 20 feet of land my husband and the others forged the deed to steal. It's always been wet here, even during the drought. A perfect, secluded spot for a burial." The marshy ground was still slightly damp and smelled strongly of stagnant water and decaying vegetation, the same environment that had sickened George Sterling years ago. Elias, driven by a journalistic hunger and a profound sense of duty, began to search. He noticed a subtle disturbance in the ground near the corner of the schoolhouse foundation, a patch of earth that was slightly darker, looser, and less overgrown than the surrounding soil. "Here," Elias said, dropping to his knees. "Someone has recently dug here." He pulled a small, sturdy shovel from his satchel, a precaution he'd bought earlier that day. He began to dig, the effort immediately taxing in the heavy, cloying soil. Ada watched, her face etched with a dreadful premonition, the iron box and the wooden doll resting on the dry ground beside her. After a few minutes of agonizing labor, the shovel hit something soft, yielding, and unmistakably fabric. Elias paused, took a deep, steadying breath, and scraped away the remaining dirt by hand. He uncovered a large canvas tarp, wrapped tightly and secured with thick rope knots. He cut the ropes with his pocket knife, his hands shaking. As he peeled back the tarp, the moonlight illuminated the final horrifying secret of Mill Creek. Beneath the canvas, lined up in a grotesque organized row, were the 13 bodies, Ms. Clara Vance and the 12 students. Samuel Miller had not desecrated the bodies. He had laid them out carefully, each child resting next to the other, a final chilling testament to his twisted moral code. They were not dressed in their daily school clothes, as Elias had seen folded in the shack, but in clean, white burial shrouds. Samuel Miller, the executioner, had also been the undertaker. Elias took a moment to look at the teacher's face. Ms. Vance's expression was one of quiet, profound sadness, not terror. It was a face that had known the secret and had faced its consequence. Ada slowly approached the makeshift grave. She looked down at the bodies, then at the crude wooden doll in her hand. "He tried to make it right," Ada whispered, tears falling onto the rough wood of the doll. "He killed them because they were part of the lie. But he buried them here, on the land that killed George, as a final perverse offering of justice. He forced them to share the fate of the first victim." The scene confirmed the entire narrative: the land theft, the cover-up, the revenge, and the twisted rationale of Samuel Miller. The schoolhouse was not just a building, it was a mausoleum of the town's hidden sin. Elias meticulously documented the scene with his camera, each body, the shrouds, the location relative to the schoolhouse. These photographs, combined with the deed and the telegram, would be irrefutable. A faint sound interrupted the silence, a single gunshot echoing from the direction of the creek. Elias and Ada looked at each other, the same question in their eyes. Sheriff Cooper. They waited, listening to the silence that followed. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of the wreck crew. There was no follow-up shot, no shout, no sirens, just silence. Elias knew the sheriff's confrontation with Samuel Miller had reached its final, fatal conclusion. They waited until the first faint traces of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Elias had the evidence. Ada had the truth. They had to return to town to call the authorities from St. Paul to secure the scene. As they left the marshy plot, Elias looked back at the single-room schoolhouse, the site of so much learning, so much betrayal, and so much horror. The building itself looked innocent, but Elias knew that its very foundations were built on a crime that had consumed its entire community. The story was not just about a disappearance. It was about the enduring psychological trauma of a secret. The full light of dawn brought not peace, but a cold, final reckoning to Mill Creek. Elias and Ada returned to the depot, where a handful of men were already tending to the train wreck. The arrival of the journalist with the iron-bound box and the elderly widow, her clothes torn and covered in swamp mud, carrying a crude doll, immediately drew attention. Elias didn't wait. He went straight to the remaining rail officials and a few of the townspeople, laying the evidence out on a cargo crate. The deed, the Vance letter, and the photographs of the burial site. The truth hit Mill Creek like a physical plague. The people, already traumatized by the vanishing, were now confronted with the 12-year-old sin of their town's founders, the murder of their children, and the psychotic logic of the killer who had walked among them for years. The telegram to St. Paul had already been received. By mid-morning, the first reporters, investigators, and a team of county medical examiners arrived by train, bypassing the wreck with difficulty. Elias provided his testimony to the lead investigator. He gave them the deed, the letter, and the gruesome photographs. He told them of Samuel Miller's motive, the location of the bodies, and the final confrontation with Sheriff Ben Cooper. The investigators immediately began the search for Cooper and Miller. They found them about a mile from the creek, in a shallow, rocky gully. Samuel Miller was dead. He had been shot twice. Sheriff Ben Cooper was also dead. He had a single, fatal gunshot wound to the chest. The official report, written by the county, would conclude that Sheriff Cooper shot Samuel Miller in the line of duty, and Miller, in a final act of malice, shot the sheriff before dying. Cooper, finally facing his duty and his family's sin, had died a hero, bringing the killer to justice. Elias knew the truth was likely different. Cooper, facing the collapse of his world, the shame of his father's actions, and the terrible realization that he himself had covered up a murder scene for weeks, probably executed Samuel Miller to ensure the final silence of the one man who could speak to the truth. Cooper's own fatal wound was likely self-inflicted, a final desperate act of justice and shame to end the cycle of sin. Elias would never report that last speculation. He would let the town have its hero. The story dominated the front pages in St. Paul and Chicago. The Mill Creek Massacre, a town built on deceit. The headlines screamed. Elias Thorne, the young journalist, was a sensation. Mill Creek did not recover. The trauma was too deep. The schoolhouse was immediately condemned and eventually torn down. The founders' names were stripped from the town records. Families moved away, unable to bear the weight of the collective guilt and the loss. The drought ended, but the blight on the town's soul remained. Elias, hailed as a hero, returned to St. Paul. He published the story, his name now synonymous with journalistic integrity. He received the praise, the attention, and the promotion he deserved. But he never forgot the silence. A year later, Elias took a solitary journey back to the site of Mill Creek. The town was mostly abandoned. The depot was closed, the boarding house was empty, the fields were overgrown, and the creek flowed again, a gentle, indifferent murmur. He walked to the site of the schoolhouse. It was just an empty foundation, a rectangle of stone covered in weeds. The marshy plot was now cordoned off. The land remained toxic, a permanent scar. Elias stood where the teacher's desk had been. He looked down and saw a faint, dusty indentation in the mud. He remembered the moment he pried up the floorboard. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the tin-type photograph. The last photo. The photo of the children, smiling, standing just hours before their deaths. He looked at the background, at the indistinct shadow. He knew who it was. Samuel Miller, the quiet groundskeeper, watching, waiting, his own righteous, twisted version of justice already planned. Elias turned the tintype over. The reverse, where he had written the date, was now stained and cracked. He noticed a small, faint final inscription he had missed before, etched into the metal frame of the photo. It was not in Miss Vance's hand. It was an older, thinner scratch. The words were barely visible. The foundation lies deeper than the stone. It was the handwriting of George Sterling's father, Elias Sterling, the man who helped forge the deed. Elias realized that the true source of terror was not Samuel Miller's revenge, but the moral decay that led to it. The initial sin was the corruption that killed George Sterling. The disappearance was merely the echo. Elias took one final photograph of the empty foundation and the silent field. He put the tintype away. He had the truth. He had the story. But he would never shake the chilling psychological terror of realizing that the greatest horrors are born not of the supernatural, but of the very real, very human capacity for greed, deceit, and years of silent, suffocating guilt. The mystery was solved, but the silence of Mill Creek remained, a quiet monument to human sin. The long shadow of the school's betrayal had finally been eclipsed, but the darkness it created would forever haunt the landscape of the American heartland.